It began with a sound no bomber crew ever wanted to hear, an explosive crack that ripped through the fuselage like a lightning bolt, tearing open the sky, followed by the violent shudder of a massive aircraft fighting to stay alive as fire engulfed its engines and shredded aluminum screamed against the wind. And in that instant, high above the war-torn European countryside, the B-17 that had once taken off as a fortress of steel and resolve transformed into a flaming coffin hurtling through the heavens. Its pilot, barely 23 years old, gripping the controls with smoke-stung eyes as the world dissolved into chaos around him, because what happened next defied physics, logic, and every law of aeronautics as the wings, those enormous, iconic slabs of aluminum that kept the flying fortress airborne, began disintegrating in mid-air, torn apart by cannon fire and explosions until the crew looked out of the gaping holes in the fuselage and saw the unthinkable. There were barely wings left at all, only twisted skeletal fragments flapping like the broken bones of a dying beast. Yet somehow, against every possible calculation, the aircraft refused to fall, suspended not by lift but by willpower, terror, and the sheer impossible determination of the young pilot who knew that one wrong breath, one wrong twitch, one wrong prayer would send all 10 souls aboard plunging into oblivion. And as smoke poured into the cockpit and the temperature climbed to furnace levels, the pilot's hands blistered against the controls, sweat stinging his eyes as alarms shrieked and the intercom erupted with the panicked voices of crewmen shouting over the roar of the dying engines. Voices trembling, breaking, pleading, each man knowing with chilling certainty that no bomber in history had ever survived this kind of damage. No pilot had ever brought a machine this destroyed back to Earth in one piece. And yet the impossible flight had only just begun. For below them, the European countryside unfurled like a patchwork of danger, with flak batteries waiting like hungry wolves, enemy fighters circling like vultures, and the wide, merciless expanse of gravity ready to claim them at any moment. But the pilot, suffocating in smoke and blinded by the hellish glow of burning fuel, forced himself to stay conscious, stay focused, stay alive, gripping the controls as if his fingers were welded to them, because he knew that if he passed out, even for a second, the burning fortress would tumble into a spinning death spiral that no one could survive. And with every second feeling like an hour, he fought to keep the crippled bomber level, using instincts sharpened by terror rather than training, because there were no manuals for this, no procedures, no instructions in any Allied handbook explaining how to land a B-17 with no wings left. And as the aircraft groaned under its own death weight, the crew watched debris fly off into the slipstream, chunks of aluminum slicing through the air like shrapnel, oxygen masks dangling uselessly, electrical systems failing one by one until the cockpit lights flickered and died, plunging the pilot into a choking darkness illuminated only by the hellfire burning along what remained of the wing roots. And yet he refused to give up, refused to surrender to the inevitability of physics, because something stronger than fear had taken hold of him, an anchor of raw, unbreakable determination forged in the crucible of every loss, every mission, every promise he had made to the men behind him. And that determination transformed the cockpit into a battleground where sheer human will wrestled against the forces of destruction. Each second a test, each breath a victory, each heartbeat a countdown toward either salvation or oblivion. And as the B-17 limped across the sky, shedding metal like a comet trailing sparks, the crew realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, something terrifying and awe-inspiring in equal measure, a moment that history would later struggle to describe. Because this was not just a damaged aircraft, this was a miracle refusing to die. A mechanical ghost kept alive by the iron resolve of a young pilot who pushed past the limits of pain, exhaustion, and human endurance to attempt the unthinkable. Land a burning, crumbling, nearly wingless bomber in one piece and bring every man home alive. A feat so impossible that even decades later, engineers, historians, and surviving crew members would say the same thing. By every measurable standard, that plane should have fallen from the sky. And what happened next? The decisions made in the next few minutes would be studied, retold, and replayed across generations as one of the most astonishing survival stories in the entire history of aerial warfare, and as the gutted, B-17 groaned through, the sky like a dying titan refusing to collapse. The pilot could feel the vibrations through the control column intensifying with every passing second. The trembling no longer just a symptom of structural damage, but a message. An unmistakable warning that the airframe was reaching its final limits. The metal fatigued to the point of tearing apart. Yet he refused to ease off, refused to surrender altitude, because he knew that if he descended too quickly, the remaining fragments of wing would rip free under the sudden rush of air, sending the aircraft spinning into a fiery plunge. And so he held the bomber as steady as a surgeon's hand, sweat pouring down his forehead, the fumes burning his throat with each breath as he fought to maintain minimal control. A control so fragile it felt like balancing a collapsing cathedral on the tip of a needle. And behind him, the crew clung to whatever remained, bolted to the floor. Oxygen tanks, bomb racks, radio equipment. Anything to hold themselves steady as turbulence rocked the crippled fuselage. Sparks showering from exposed wiring, loose panels slamming against the airflow, each metallic crash echoing like distant thunder. Yet through the chaos, the intercom crackled alive with the trembling voice of the tail gunner, reporting that enemy fighters, those sleek, lethal predators of the Luftwaffe, were circling below them, uncertain whether the flaming wreck above was still alive or already dead. And the pilot, hearing this, felt a cold spike of dread pierce through his exhaustion, because he knew that if they drew attention, even a single burst of cannon fire would sever what remained of the wing roots and doom them all. But he also knew that if they slowed too much, the crippled aircraft would stall. And so he threaded the impossible line between life and death, adjusting throttle and rudder with the precision of a master pianist performing on an instrument falling apart under his hands. Every movement measured, every decision carrying the weight of 10 human lives. And as he fought this impossible battle, the smoke grew thicker, swirling around him in suffocating waves, forcing him to lean sideways to breathe through the shattered window where freezing air tore across his face. But even that cold wasn't enough to counter the heat radiating from the burning engines, the flames licking dangerously close to the fuel tanks. And the pilot knew with gut-wrenching certainty that if the fire reached the internal lines feeding the remaining functional engine, the bomber would erupt into an airborne inferno. Yet he pushed those thoughts from his mind, locking himself into a razor-sharp tunnel vision as the altimeter needle dipped lower and lower, the horizon trembling in his vision, the sky ahead flickering with distortion from the rising heat, and for a moment, a terrifying, breath-stealing moment, he thought he felt the wing root on the starboard side buckle completely, a judder that rippled through the entire bomber like the shiver of a beast in its final seconds. But he held firm, clenching the yoke so tightly the tendons in his arms felt like they might snap. Every ounce of strength and instinct funneling into keeping the nose level, because surrendering now would mean betraying every man behind him. And there were screams, shouts, prayers, some frantic, some silent, woven into the thunder of the wind tearing through the ruptured fuselage. But through all of it, the pilot remained the lone, immovable center of the storm, his heart pounding like a drum of war, his vision blurring with tears of smoke and strain, but his mind sharper than it had ever been, calculating angles, adjusting trim with fingertips blistered by metal heated from flames. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the radio crackled weakly, the voice of the bombardier breaking through the static with a mixture of terror and awe as he reported that the bomb bay doors, warped by heat, twisted by impacts, shaking violently in the slipstream, were beginning to peel away from the hinges, threatening to rip off entirely and take half the belly of the plane with them. And the pilot, hearing this, felt his pulse spike, because if the bomb bay tore open, the sudden drag would flip the bomber upside down, and so he executed a maneuver so delicate it bordered on miraculous shifting weight, redistributing thrust, coaxing the battered airframe to hold together for just a few moments longer, every second stretching into eternity as the bomber limped across the sky like a wounded dragon trailing fire, the landscape beneath them rolling by in blurred patches of green and gray and smoke. And still the pilot refused to yield, refused to falter, pushing himself past the limits of pain and fear into a realm of pure instinctual survival. Because in the end, there was only one truth that mattered. He had to land the aircraft. Even if the aircraft was no longer truly an aircraft, but a burning skeleton of metal and memory, and as the next phase of this impossible flight loomed ahead, the airfield still impossibly far, the wings nearly gone, the engine coughing its last breaths, the pilot braced himself for the most dangerous descent in the history of bomber aviation, a descent that would determine whether this miracle held together or whether gravity would finally claim its due. It was a day like no other. High above the jagged terrain of occupied Europe, where the sun cut through thin clouds with an almost cruel clarity, illuminating the sky in brilliant white and the dark smoke of burning cities far below, as a lone B-17 flying fortress, nicknamed the Defiant Spirit, streaked across the heavens, its engines roaring like a chorus of fury against the relentless advance of the Luftwaffe, and inside the cockpit, Captain John Jack Reynolds gripped the yoke with a resolve that could only have been forged in the crucible of repeated combat sorties. Sweat trickling down his brow despite the thin, frigid air at 25,000 feet, eyes scanning, calculating, anticipating every possible contingency, while simultaneously praying for a miracle that he knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, might never come. Because this was not just another mission, another day of dropping bombs and evading enemy fire. This was a flight that would test every ounce of skill, courage, and improvisation he had acquired over years of aerial combat. A flight that would challenge the very definition of possibility. For somewhere in the middle of the Bavarian countryside, a catastrophic series of events had begun to unfold, starting with a distant but unmistakable detonation, the concussive shock rocking the fuselage and sending rivets rattling along the metal skin. The smell of acrid smoke wafting up through the ventilation as warning lights flared in rapid succession, indicating that the unthinkable had occurred. A direct hit from flak had ignited the left wing, the main fuel tank ruptured, and a trail of fire was now licking the fuselage with a hunger that threatened to consume the aircraft entirely. And in that instant, the carefully drilled routines of bomber crew training collided violently with the stark reality of survival. For Reynolds knew that once a wing was compromised, once the structural integrity of a B-17 was called into question, the laws of physics offered no mercy, no second chances. Yet despite the inferno raging beside him, despite alarms screaming in unison like a chorus of doom, Reynolds' mind snapped into focus, cataloging every possible maneuver, every potential outcome, every tiny variable in a scenario that few men had ever faced and none had survived without some measure of divine intervention, as his crew, a collection of equally disciplined and terrified young men, scrambled to contain the fire, administer first aid, and maintain the controls that were now responding sluggishly, almost betraying them under the weight of structural damage and superheated hydraulics, and outside, the enemy fighters, alerted by the telltale smoke, began their approach. Black silhouettes slicing through the sky with lethal precision, while below the ground advanced rapidly, fields and forests blurring as if the earth itself conspired to meet the burning machine with unforgiving finality, and Reynolds, staring at the twisted gauges, the flames curling upward in brilliant orange tongues against the backdrop of white clouds, made a decision that no pilot should ever have to make. He would attempt to fly. No, to land. A B-17 with a burning wing, a plane that was literally falling apart, with engines overheating, controls semi-disabled, and the life of every man aboard hanging by a thread thinner than the aluminum skin of the fuselage itself. And in that moment, the calculations of altitude, speed, wind, enemy trajectory, and structural limits compressed into a single, fluid process in his mind, as if the years of training, instinct, and sheer human will coalesced into a single purpose. A singular mission to defy death in its most immediate and terrifying form. And as he called out to his crew, issuing commands that were both precise and calming, his voice cutting through the roar of engines and the crackling of fire, the enormity of the situation became clear. They were alone in enemy airspace, their formation shattered, their defensive guns partially disabled, and every second now counted in the calculus of survival. A calculus that balanced weight, drag, lift, and momentum against gravity, fire, and human vulnerability. And yet, despite the impossibility of the scenario, Reynolds' mind refused to dwell on despair, refusing to succumb to fear, instead scanning the horizon for every potential path to safety, charting a course toward a friendly airstrip dozens of miles away, all the while issuing orders to his crew to prepare for water ditching, bailouts, and emergency procedures, because he knew that even a fraction of hesitation could mean certain death. And as the aircraft shuddered violently, the left wing now barely holding shape, panels buckling and windows popping under heat, Reynolds adjusted throttle and yoke with precision that seemed almost preternatural, coaxing the wounded bird forward with a mixture of technical mastery and desperate intuition, navigating through flak, clouds, and enemy fighters, knowing that one miscalculation could send them spiraling into oblivion. And in the midst of this chaos, the crew began to experience their own mixture of awe and terror as they watched the captain manipulate the aircraft with a combination of skill and instinct that seemed to bend reality, performing maneuvers that defied logic, physics, and expectation as the burning wing threatened to collapse with every passing second, smoke filling the fuselage, alarms screaming, metal groaning like tortured flesh, and yet somehow they continued to fly. A testament to human courage, machine endurance, and sheer willpower in the face of almost certain annihilation. And as the ground drew nearer, as the smoke thickened and visibility narrowed, Reynolds's mind raced through every option for landing: the slope of the field, the soft mud patches, the direction of wind, the angle of approach, the possibility of skidding or flipping, the absolute fragility of a plane with no wing integrity. And with every calculation, every adjustment, every inch of control wrung from a machine designed for combat, not impossible survival, he inched closer to a feat that would later be described as miraculous. A landing so improbable that historians, engineers, and pilots for decades would marvel at it with incredulity. And as he touched down, skidding over dirt and debris, fire still licking at the fuselage, engines groaning their final protest, the plane somehow remained upright, coming to rest with a shudder, a roar, and a cloud of dust. And the crew, shaken, scorched, and trembling, realized that they had survived the unthinkable, that against all probability, all laws of physics, and all expectations of enemy and environment alike, the B-17 had been brought safely to Earth, leaving an indelible mark on the annals of aviation history, a story of courage, skill, and the human instinct to fight against overwhelming odds. And as the fire crews rushed forward, as explosions threatened in the background, and as the stunned enemy observers took in the scene, the significance of what had just occurred settled in. This was not merely a landing. It was a defiance of death itself, a testament to human ingenuity under pressure, and the beginning of a story that would ripple through time, inspiring awe, disbelief, and reverence for the pilot who had taken a burning, wingless B-17 across the sky and, against all reason, set it down safely, a story that demands attention, engagement, and complete immersion from anyone who witnesses it. And this was only the first minute of the saga, the hook that drags the viewer into the extraordinary, impossible journey of one man, his crew, and a plane that should never have survived. As the B-17 struggled to stay aloft, smoke curling like serpents through the fuselage, the crew grappled with an escalating nightmare, their senses assaulted by heat, the stench of burning metal, and the deafening roar of failing engines, while outside, the jagged mountains of enemy territory stretched endlessly beneath them, each mile a terrifying countdown toward potential destruction. And in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds' hands moved with almost superhuman precision, adjusting throttles, trim, and flaps in a delicate, near-impossible ballet, countering the aircraft's dangerous tendency to list toward the destroyed left wing, calculating the diminishing lift and the irregular airflow with intuition honed over.